pleasure to introduce Father Thomas Michel as our speaker today. With a PhD in Arabic and Islamic Studies from the University of Chicago, Father Michel is among the world's experts in Islamic spirituality and Muslim Christian understanding, with special emphasis on Sayyid Nursi's views on Muslim Christian understanding. He has published over 24 books on these subjects. Among his most recent books is Peace and Dialogue in a Plural Society, Contributions of the Hizmet Movement in a Time of Global Tension. Father Michel is former head of the Vatican Office for Islam in the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, and Secretary for Interreligious Dialogue in Rome, and Ecumenical Secretary for the Federation of Asian Bishops' Conferences. He's been International Visiting Fellow at Georgetown University's Woodstock Theological Center and faculty member at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service Doha campus. He has taught and lectured virtually around the world, and most recently is heading up the new Xavier Learning Center in Chiang Mai, Thailand. Today, Father Michel will describe Jesuit work in Thailand with the Asian Muslim Action Network, Oman, an interfaith organization focusing on humanitarian aid and peace building in conflict areas throughout Asia. Father Michel has also agreed, if we have time, to offer some observations about his recent research on Muslims in northern Thailand. So please help me welcome today Father Thomas Michel to speak to us on Muslims and Christians in Thailand.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Today, I guess the two groups that I want to start out with and tell you something about. One is the Asian Muslim Action Network, and the other would be the Jesuits in Asia. In case any of you don't know, the Asian Muslim Action Network is a body of Muslims, progressive Muslims, we should say, and they identify themselves as such, in 16 Asian countries. It was founded in 1990 in Bangladesh, and some of the big names of Muslim intellectuals were among those that were kind of the guiding lights. You might remember the late Ali Azhar engineer, who has written very active, of India. Chandra Muzaffar from Malaysia, the sociologist. Imtiaz Yusuf, who is still in Thailand. Abdurrahman Wahid, the former president of Indonesia, was one of the founders. And today, the organization is led by its first woman president. Her name is Dwi Rubianti Khalifa, and everybody calls her Ruby Khalifa. And she's really brought a lot of new life to the organization. So as I said, the organization has branches in 16 Asian countries, and so for me, when we meet, it's really interesting, to be meeting as well Muslims from Afghanistan and from China and places that ordinarily I don't get to. So how do they understand themselves? This will give you kind of an idea of who they are. Their mission statement is this: the Asian Muslim Action Network, Oman, is an organization of progressive Muslims in Asia seeking to respond to numerous challenges that the people in Asia are facing. Such problems include, and then they mentioned 5 of them: elite corruption, materialistic lifestyle, ethnic tension. I might add that after there was an attack against Christian churches in in Indonesia about 6 months ago. They made a very strong statement condemning that. And they said that no Muslim can justify such action. They did a very good statement. I wrote to Ruby to say, well done. And fourth one is violence against women and children. They're very active in women's issues in Asia. And probably the Muslim organization that is most active in really working on women's issues. And the fifth one is environmental degradation. So these are the 5 they mentioned. Now, then they state at the end of their mission statement, Aman seeks active collaboration with other communities of faith in order to promote human dignity and social justice. So they actively are looking for co-workers, cooperators from other religions. This is actually how I got to know them. Let's see, it would have been even before the founding of the organization when they were still talking about it. Abdurrahman Wahid, the late Abdurrahman Wahid, he said the thing that we all have to do if we're interested in any kind of interfaith cooperation is the first step is to identify those in the other religion that are willing to work with us. Who are the people? He says, not everybody, Muslims can't work with any group of Christians, and Christians can't work with any group of Muslims, and the same with Hindus or Buddhists or whatever. And so, as it happened, we Jesuits were looking for people to be working with in Asia. About the same time they were looking for somebody, and so they invited Jesuits from several countries in Asia to the founding meeting of Amman. And we gave our input, and it was not just a token thing. They really were looking for our points of view and that. So we've really been with them since 1990, so 1990, 2000, almost 30 years now. And we've been really involved in almost every program that they set up. What are some of these programs? They do a School of Peace Studies and Conflict Transformation every year. They've done it 18 times. They're starting another one on the 14th of February, so just in about a week from now. And they get usually it's about 60 students from Asia every year. And in addition to giving the Islamic bases for peace building and work in peace, they also ask Christians and Hindus and Buddhists to give their point of view. So I think at most of their peace studies there are Christian participants, and usually they're Jesuits. Then they have this Amana Media Initiative, and they produce a journal, Amana. So it's both online and in hard copy, and it's good. And then a third one is research fellowships for young Muslims, and a research program, Islamic Responses, an initiative on HIV and AIDS. They're really one of the few Muslim groups in Asia that has really raised seriously the whole question of HIV and AIDS, which in a number of countries in Asia is still very much of an issue. One of the good things that they do is they published about 25 books on these various topics, and I just picked out several here to give you an idea of the kind of things that they... one is called Speaking Up, Muslim Views on HIV and AIDS. Another, Sexual Culture Among Young Migrant Muslims in Bangkok. Another one, Religious Perspectives on Climate Change. Another one, Perspectives on Polygamy and Post-Reform Indonesia. Another one is Development and Decline of Beijing's Hui Muslim Community. Another one is Imaging Muslim Women in Indonesian Ramadan Soap Operas. And then the last one that I copied, there are more, but I just copied some of the most interesting. The shift in zakat practice in Indonesia from piety to an Islamic socio-political economic system. So these are our partners. Now, who are the Jesuits in Asia? You might know that the Jesuits around the world, in terms of projects and working together, apostolate, were divided into what we call assistancies. And this rather strange word, assistancy, goes back to the fact that the general in Rome has an assistant from each of these areas. And Asia has two assistancies, South Asian assistancy and East Asian assistancy. But early on, we discovered that, it really wasn't going well, since Asia is one place. We really felt we should be working together. So we have a joint committee for relations with Muslims. So South Asian and East Asian Muslims. And committee has got people from Pakistan, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. And so we've been working together with Muslims in various parts of Asia for about 20 years now. And so when I go back to Thailand at the end of this week, I have a meeting right away with Oman, and we're preparing our next conference, international conference. It'll be on ethnic and religious minorities in Asia. From the Muslim point of view, they're very concerned, as you can imagine, about the situation of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, and now the equally disturbing situation of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang in China. And so what to do about these? What kind of effective protests or actions can you take in countries that seem to be deaf to any kind of criticism or protest? They just ignore it. But, well, one thing we are doing is the humanitarian part. We're working together to collect money. We send people about once a month to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where most of the Rohingya are those who have left the country, are staying refugees. What we've been able to do in Burma is really not very much. The government is really kind of prevents much from going on there, but we want to look at that. And of course, from the Christian point of view, we're also concerned about two things: religious minorities, places where Christians are a minority, where it's difficult for them to operate, where they live in fear. And then secondly, like where I come from, the big concerns are the ethnic minorities who are sometimes Christian, sometimes Buddhist. The people in our area are all what are called hill tribe people. And there's a very real discrimination. Many of them don't have full citizenship, Thai citizenship. There's a lot of discrimination against them. They get paid less for doing the same work as Thais. They have fewer educational opportunities. Most of our students still don't have electricity and running water, and they're religious. So it's a real basic existence. So we're concerned about that. And the whole thing that we're trying to move towards in Asia is a country where the majority-minority thing is not an issue. We want to build a society where where it's not relevant whether you're a majority or minority. So the Jesuits in Asia, then we have an association, we have a worldwide association we call JAM, Jesuits Among Muslims. And JAM, we have a JAM session once every couple of years. The next one is being planned this year, actually, later on, it's August, in Lebanon. And then besides that, we have JAMA, which is Jesuits Among Muslims in Asia. And that's the organization we just had our last meeting in Sri Lanka at Christmas time and New Year's time. And so it's JAMA that does most of the work together with the Muslims. So as I said, we're getting ready for a planning meeting of our next conference on religious and ethnic minorities in Asia, together with the Oman. So to move on, let me say a bit about our Muslims in Thailand. The group of Muslims in Thailand that everybody hears about, of course, are the Malay Muslims in the 3 southern provinces of Yala, Narathiwat, and Atani. And the reason we hear about them is, on the one hand, some of the Muslims are militantly looking for a kind of autonomy, and on the other hand, the Thai military is putting down such activism very brutally. And so there's about, the figures I've seen are about 7.5 million Muslims in Thailand. Now, an interesting thing, though, that a lot of people don't know, is that less than 20% of these are in the southern provinces. So only about 18% of the Muslims, this is the official figure from the Thai government, 18% of the Muslims are in the 3 southern provinces, where they make up over 30% of the population. So that means there's a lot of Muslims other places. Now, the Muslims in the south are part of the Malay world. In fact, they were Malay states that were divided up in 1894, I believe, between Britain, who had occupied the Malay states, and Thailand. Both of them had claims, and so Thailand got 4 and England got 3. And so a line was drawn. So the people north of the line, they speak a form of Malay, very close to that of Malaysia, and they are Shafi'i Muslims, as are the Muslims in Malaysia, and Singapore, and Indonesia. But our Muslims have a different background altogether. They mostly come from China. And they've come in several waves of migration as refugees generally, and very often as business people also. Probably the biggest group came from what's sometimes called the Pantai Rebellion. You might remember in mid-19th century in the Yunnan province of southwest China, 1856, many of the Muslims went out in rebellion and started their own Sultanate of Yunnan. And it lasted for about 15 years. Now, all these people who went out in the Pantai rebellion were not Muslims. There were a lot of hill tribe people who were allied with them, and also some Han people. Well, they lasted for a while. The leader was a man named Du Wenshu, who when he became the Sultan, he took on the name of Suleiman, his Islamic name, and they governed quite a bit of area. They had 40 towns, 100 villages. He dressed in Chinese clothes, which is interesting. Why would he do that? Well, because he was protesting against the Manchu dynasty. he was quite anti-Manchu. He wasn't anti-Chinese, he was anti-Manchu. And so he wore Chinese clothes, but he banned pork in the whole area. And so they had this independent sultanate for a long time. He called himself the Qa'id Jami al-Muslimin, so the leader of the community of Muslims. So not really a traditional title, even though it was in Arabic. Now, of course, remember 19th century, nothing went on in the world without either British or French involvement, and this had both. The new sultanate, the Sultan Suleiman, he sent his son Hassan to Queen Victoria to see if the British would send troops to protect them from the Chinese Imperial Army, and the British decided not to. They welcomed him, but they didn't give any help. On the other hand, the French were supplying the Imperial Army that eventually in 1873 came in and destroyed the Sultanate, killed probably upwards of 1 million people. There were great massacres. So all those Muslims and hill tribe people who could fled the country, and they went over the border to either Myanmar or Thailand. And so this was the first big migration of Chinese Muslims. They set up something like 70 villages in Thailand itself, and in Myanmar there's even more. Now, most of the ones who were economically better off, they went to Myanmar. And the people who are called Pantai Muslims, they have, up until today, a very strong role to play in Myanmar economy. But also in Thailand, we got a good number of these Chinese immigrants who fled over. Interestingly enough, the hill tribe people who also fled the same repression with the Muslims, that was how we got our hill tribe people, and that's where the students in our school, their grandparents would have come from Lahu or Miao or Tai Yai, these different groups that had been in Yunnan state. So that was the first migration. Second migration was much more recent, after 1949, when the Kuomintang forces were defeated by the communist forces. Most of the Kuomintang, the pro-nationalist forces, went to Taiwan, as you know, but those, and including a whole army of Kuomintang, they went out the back door. They went out from Yunnan, and they went first to Myanmar. And in 1953, they were on the point, really, of conquering Shan state in Myanmar and setting up their own independent government. When Myanmar really got mobilized and drove them out of Myanmar, most of them then went across the border into Thailand. Now, you have to remember that up until 30 years ago, the transportation infrastructure just did not exist in this border area where we live in northern Thailand. There were no roads. So how did you go? You went by mule caravan until 30 years ago. It was mules that carried everything, whether it was normal goods like clothing and that, or whether it was opium, which became quite an important product in the 50s, especially the 60s and 70s. And so that meant that the Thai army, the Burmese army, that these were places that were difficult for them to get, and they had very little control over it. In fact, I was just at Christmas I went to a Karen village in Myanmar on the border, and I didn't need a passport or anything because it was like outside of Myanmar. I mean, around the village there was a whole ring of landmines that were planted by the people in the refugee camp to keep the Myanmar army out. And then around that was a second ring of landmines planted by the Myanmar army to keep the people from leaving. So how did you get in? Well, you got in from the river. And well, if you can imagine, 100 years ago, and really not even 100 years ago, 50, 60 years ago, the whole area was outside of the central authority, whether it be in Yangon or in Bangkok. And so you had, what you had instead were a number of warlords and private armies, and many of them also had Chinese background, and among them were prominently Chinese Muslims. So I'll give you an example of, there's one town called Mesalong. Mesalong was a Kuomintang village. It was set up by refugees from China. They carried on a regular war against the communists in China for a long time. Sometimes there were battles, one would win, the other would win. And this really went on until early 1970s, I think 1972, when the Thai government made an agreement with them that they would help police Thailand's Thailand's communist insurgents, you might say. So they kind of made a deal with the Chinese government. So you have in the middle of Thailand this quite nice, really beautiful little Chinese village. Now, in Taiwan, they saw these people as fellow opponents of the communist regime, so they set up what was it called? The Free China Association, and gave lots of money to the people in Mesalong, and they developed it. But they did something even more important, is they gave some of the precious oolong tea plants that they had brought from mainland China with them when they left it in 49. And so the area now is a great tea producing area, and produces very fine tea. So the Taiwan government helped them in a good way, and then they made this alliance with the Thai government. Well, my point of all this is every one of these villages has a mosque. You don't expect to see some isolated little village in northern Thailand, and you find generally a very beautiful mosque in the Chinese style. I don't know if you know the Chinese mosque architecture is quite different from other parts of the world. The minarets tend to be kind of fat, sort of like our at the airports, for the air controllers, these kind of big things with a round area for people to sit. So so they're very much Chinese mosques. The other place that I want to mention, because it's also very important part of the history of Muslims in northern Thailand. It's a place that's now called Turk Thai. It was formerly an Akha village. Akha are whole tribe people who've come from China to Thailand. But in the 1960s, one of the most famous or infamous warlords, a man named Kun Sa, he set up his headquarters in Ban Hintek. he was a Shan nationalist and was in favor of Shan independence. He was operating quite independently in Burma, in Myanmar, until he was driven out by the Burmese army. And so he crossed the border, right across the border, in this big valley, and he set up his headquarters. Now, he financed his operation, as did the Kuomintang, I should add, by opium sales. And he was also, but he wasn't greedy. He really had this idea of building a kind of an ideal place. He built health centers, he built schools around, Chinese schools, though he was not Chinese himself. He was very importantly Chinese. I mean, he was very sympathetic to Chinese. And he also had a number of Muslims in his army. And he built them a very nice mosque in Turtai. I was in Turtai, or on Intek. See, the Thais renamed it when they finally took control of the village. So Turtai means kind of the glory of Thailand, you might say. But the people always still call it by its old name. But when I was there, I was just amazed to see this beautiful, small but very beautiful mosque in this very isolated village in Thailand. And I met the imam who was a Thai Muslim, but had spent 20 years in Japan working, and then had returned and was acting as minister. He said they still have 11 families who are Muslim, who had been in Kunsa's army. Now I've read just about all the historical reports, there aren't that many as you might imagine, on Kunsa, and it never mentions Muslims in his army, except one place. At one point, the Burma All-Muslim Organization made a statement in his favor. So you get the idea that there must have been quite a bit of sympathy towards Kunsa as a Shan nationalist. But in all of these places you will find a number of Chinese mosques, Chinese-style mosques. So you go into the library of the mosque, and you'll get the Quran in Chinese. You'll get the writings of the great Muslim scholars of China. Chiang Mai, the big city of the north, has 7 Chinese mosques. Chiang Rai, which is nearer to us, farther north, has 4 mosques. Most famous is one called Darul Aman, so Darul Aman, but Darul Aman, and that's also built by Muslims from China. Masai on the border has 3 mosques, plus 1 Malay mosque. And the other one other town I should mention is Mesot, which is on the west. They received quite a few Rohingya Muslim refugees. And so it really looks like a Muslim town. You'll see the women are all in abayas, and the men are wearing the white caps. And so many Muslims fled, not the majority of Rohingya Muslims fled to Bangladesh, but some fled east to Thailand, and Mesot is the border town. So these are just some of the things that I put together from what I've been able to do in Thailand. So I'd like to open it up to anybody who wants to make any comments or ask any questions. Yes?
Question. The Chinese Muslims, were they Hui people, like, H-U-Y? Were they ethnic Han that had converted?
They were Hui, yeah. And in fact, in Thai, they are called Chin Ho. And they say that this is a corruption of Chin Hui. So they are we, yes.
Can I just ask a clarification on that? So when you say that we, do you mean Turkic or Han?
Neither nor. The Turkish Muslims are not
The
the
Chinese?
Chinese are Han.
Yeah.
And the Chinese Muslims who speak Chinese and dress like Chinese, they're Hui.
Okay.
And then there's the Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang,
Right.
who are nowadays called Uyghur, although that term only exists since the 20th century.
Right.
And so they're completely different. They speak a form of Turkish,
Right.
but are not Hui.
So the
They're a
ones who,
separate nationality.
so the ones who came over into Thailand are we, meaning non-Turkic Chinese Muslims.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned that one of the books that you listed was the disappearance and the problems of Hui. Does Oman really do much of anything with Hui rights as opposed to supporting Uyghurs and things like that?
Once I was at an Amman conference that we did in Kunming, which is the capital of Yunnan province, and it was on the whole question of Muslim minorities in Yunnan. So they did have this conference, but when you say, can they do anything? They can't really do much more than kind of study and become more aware of the situation. They really don't have a lot of power don't have any clout.
Once I saw a very strange reference to Hui converts to Christianity. Do you know of any? Is that any kind of a category that's enough to look at, or?
Yeah, John, I don't know. I don't know any. I don't know that there are any. I mean, to my knowledge. No.
Question. These Muslims in Thailand or in China, are they distinct in some way apart from the religion they follow? Are they part of the culture, or they are getting assimilated, or they exist as a distinct, separate minority? Would seem to cause more problems. I don't know.
Yeah. The way that you would notice as a Muslim, the women will wear a headdress, will wear something on their head, usually a scarf. And then there's always the Muslim restaurants. I know about 6 or 7 halal restaurants in Chiang Rai. I know 2 in Mesai. There really isn't not a great distinction, and I think
So
among
they
the men
consider-
you would know the men don't wear caps.
Yeah. They consider themselves as Thai.
Yeah.
Language also.
Language is Thai.
Okay.
When I first got to Thailand, every time I would either be in a halal restaurant or in a mosque, I'd say, well, do you speak Malay? They didn't know any Malay. They didn't know a word of Malay. That's in the north, of course. Yes.
I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the religious complexity of what in Thailand, given what you've already said, and I know it's a tricky question, but in a Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, many of the indigenous peoples there came from some of the places you've mentioned, and some others are more indigenous still. So
The vast majority of people in northern Thailand are people that we would call Lanna, L-A-N-N-A. Now this was an independent kingdom for a long time, and they speak Thai, but they speak a very distinctive form of Thai, and people can tell right away who they are. And they are virtually all Buddhists. Now at our school we have 5 from the Lanna group. So they're lowlanders, mainly farmers are living in cities, and so that's the vast majority of people. Now, aside from that, there are the hill tribe people, are the ethnic minorities. The largest group of them would be Karen. They call themselves Pequeño. They don't use the word Karen, it's a word used by foreigners. The second largest group would be a group, so their origins are more in the direction of Myanmar. And their language is Tibeto-Burmese, so it's not a tonal language. Then the second group would be, biggest group would be Akha, A-K-H-A. They came pretty much the same time the Muslims did in the 1870s. Many of them fled, and they would be, along the border, they would have the most villages.
And religion?
And among the, okay, backing up, among the Karen, now the American Baptists got there very early, and so the majority of Karen would be Baptist, both in Myanmar and in Thailand. As I said, in Myanmar, many more Karen in Myanmar than in Thailand, and the majority are Protestant, Baptist. A minority are Buddhists, are Catholic, and there are some Karen Muslims as well. And then among the Akha, there are more Catholics. Lahu, mostly Protestants. Hmong, mostly Protestant. Among the hill tribe people, they'd be mostly Protestants. But then there's another whole religious factor that I haven't mentioned, and that is the traditional religion. See, in every one of our Buddhist temples, you won't see this so much in Protestant churches, you might in the Catholic Church though, but especially in Buddhist temples, aside from the big Buddhist temple in Thai style, you'll also see a little shrine, and there will be figures in there that have no relation to Buddhism. It'll be traditional figures, and very often they'll be quite often visited. People will come and they'll bring flowers or incense, candles, little things made out of cloth, little gifts, in other words. Now this will be right on the grounds of the temple, and so that's really still popular. If you look at some religious atlases, Atlas of the Religions of the World, you'll see this big Buddhist swath in Southeast Asia, with going up through the mountains of Vietnam, up through Laos, and up to the hill tribe area where I live. It'll say a traditional religion. It's still quite important. And among our Catholic students, some of the rituals from the traditional religion will still be important to them. Some of them are saying, well, for us it has cultural value. But I think others said, very much.
Buddhism obviously came from India and spread west. Are there any remnants of what you're talking about, the Hindu religion? Because part of it was Hindu.
Yes, there is a minority, a Hindu minority of people of Indian origin, businessmen, many of them quite wealthy. Many of the cloth stores, the hotels in Bangkok and in Chiang Mai will be Indian, and they'll have their Indian statues of the. We have one big Indian shopping mall in our little town of Chengsen with.
Actually, what I meant when you say native religion, was it remnants of ancient Hindu religion?
I don't think so. It seems to be very Indian. You know, the statues seem to be very much, you know, like Hinduism in Indonesia. You see, well, this is its own thing. This has been cut off from international Hinduism for so long. But this is not like that. Ours, what we find, you know, what you would find, same thing in India. And I think it's this Hindu minority that we have. Tend to be business people. Yes.
Thanks so much for your talk, by the way. Very interesting. And a couple questions. First on the Hui Muslims you mentioned. So for many of these guys, I know there were quite a few Hui who fought for the KMU. So did some of those survivors basically, are they the ones in the second migration who came to Thailand? And when they came, did they kind of preserve their culture, preserve some of their traditions in a way that maybe it has not been possible for Hui Muslims living in China as of now with the current Mazda destructions and the restrictions on education and things like that?
Yeah.
And
Of course, they wouldn't have gone through any of that, those who left China. Now, in this town called Thai that I was talking about, they have a Chinese school. And the Chinese school is a very traditional Chinese school. And the traditions are taught there probably not very different from the way they were taught in 1949. They also go to the Thai National School, so that the students go all morning until mid-afternoon to the Thai school, and then they go to the Chinese school in the afternoon, starting I think at 5 o'clock. They go from 5 to 8, which to me is a sign that they really are concerned about preserving their traditions.
So you mean the classics? They're learning the classics?
Yes, they're learning the classics. Now, another thing in Turk Thai is this huge museum of the revolution, of the people who left the revolution, with the name cards for all the people who died fighting against the communists. Oh, and there's thousands of them because there were so many. It was huge. And then the picture. But the interesting thing is that the building is in classical Chinese form. It's a very Chinese building, you know, the pagoda type building. And so Turk Thai, I think, would be probably the purest. Mesolama. So those are the places that I've seen. Now you have a lot of other small Thai villages, and you'll find writing in Chinese on the walls and above the doors and that, but no real attempt to revive or preserve the tradition. And in fact, many of them have now moved into the cities because there's more opportunities for education, occupation, and that kind of thing. So generally, when the Chinese move out, the Akha move in. So many of those villages have now become mostly Akha. Even Turk Thai has got an Akha majority. But I think you wanted to ask something further.
I had one more question, thank you. So you know, Imtiaz Yusuf, you actually written quite a bit on the Chula Rajamantri, the institution of Muslims in Thailand. And I'm wondering, one thing I understood from that is there's almost a tension between the Malays of the South, who want some sort of, almost like a Chula Rajamantri of their own in many ways, versus the ones who get appointed to this kind of official position of like a mufti for Muslims, which is generally from Bangkok or some of the bigger cities, and they tend to be Thai Muslims. So do these hill tribes, do these northern Muslims kind of far off, do they play into that, or are they also, you know, suffering from these issues of citizenship and being in these kind of rural areas? Or do they get this representation?
No, they're much more integrated, I would think. Those things are just not an issue in northern Thailand. They seem very distant from kind of Muslim battles of who is the Chula Mantri and no, it doesn't. I've been to the south and I've lived in Bangkok, and those things are much more heatedly discussed and debated. But in the north, no, you don't find people talking about that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question, quick question. Do you talk about the Muslim in the South Asia, but do you know any, these people did have any, for example, idea about the politics or thought or something like this, for example, about the government or these issues or not?
Well, of course, not all Muslims would feel the same. Some are highly politicized, particularly in the South. I think people are poorer and they feel more oppressed, and so there's more discontent. There's more feeling that, see, they really feel they feel like Malaysians. They're close to Malaysia culturally, historically, religiously. They're Shafi Muslims like them. Linguistically, they speak the same language, Malay. And you might remember during World War II that the Thais were often sympathetic to the Japanese, and the Muslims tended to be more sympathetic to the British, who were in Malaysia. When World War II was over, there was a kind of a dispute between England and the United States. England wanted to really punish the Thais. They said they were collaborators and they were losers, so they lost the war and they should be punished. And the Americans said no. They saw Thailand as kind of the bulwark against communism in Asia. So the British were really saying that, okay, it's time to put the 3 southern Malay provinces into Malaysia, which was being formed at the time. And the Americans said no. But from that time on, there's been this feeling among the southern Malay Muslims that, history has treated us wrongly. We're in the wrong country. We're a tiny minority among people who don't understand us and who don't appreciate us. And so a feeling of either wanting independence or unity with Malaysia. Up in the north, the Muslims don't feel oppressed. As a matter of fact, Thailand was a liberating experience for them to come to a place where they escaped the persecutions in China and then later in Myanmar. And so they're quite happy with it. They learned to speak Thai. They not very politically oriented at all. So a lot of people's political orientation depends on how well you feel yourself in your situation. If you feel oppressed, if you feel disliked, if you feel discriminated against, then you're going to be more politically active than if you feel, well, everything's going fine, where you want to be. So in North, we don't see so much of that. Yes, sir.
Small questions about traditional culture. It's very fascinating to me. Is there a Confucian element or ancestor veneration? And I also wanted to ask, in those little chapels, what are the faces of the traditional deities like? Are they human? Are they ancestor? Do you have any sense of that?
They look like people. They look like little dolls. They look like people. They aren't. See, in a Buddhist temple, a Thai Buddhist temple, the figures would be very stylized. They'd look very dramatic and beautiful. Whereas in the little shrines, no, they look like little dolls. Really, and people
Any
put
sense of ancestors?
gifts.
Any
Yeah,
sense of-
ancestors.
Yeah.
And an interesting thing I find, which has to do with when we talk in Christian terms, is my students don't see any difference between ghost and spirit and angel. them. It's you know, it's one thing, you can talk about the spirits. Oh, there's spirits all over. Or sometimes they'll talk about the angels. Angels are all over. Sometimes they'll talk about the ghosts. They believe, all of them believe very strongly in all of these.
And so different words for each one of them.
No,
No.
same words for, they're alternatives really. And so of course if we talk about spirit, well then that sounds quite Christian, doesn't it? Or angel. Although the Thais have knots which are like angels or spirits also, you know. And so it's a different way to make distinctions, and our students who all come from villages, they would really know quite a bit about the spirits or about the ghosts. And sometimes when they're talking about the worship at the shrines, at the popular religion, they'll talk about that as worshiping ghosts, worshiping spirits. They usually say ghosts. Or some of them will say, well, I used to worship ghosts, but then I became a Christian. No, I don't.
But they still communicate with
Yeah.
Could you comment on the role of the monarchy in interreligious? I have two questions. This is the first one. Could you comment on the role of the monarchy in interreligious dialogue, and could you comment on the historical relationship that the Jesuits have had with the monarchy in Thailand?
Yeah. Well, the Jesuits first started in Thailand in Lopburi. I guess it was 16th century, so they got there very early. And then from there they went to Ayutthaya and were there until it was destroyed by the Burmese. And the ruins of the Jesuit church in both Lopburi and in Ayutthaya are still there. And they even had a college in Ayutthaya at one point. I don't think it had many students, maybe 19, 20 students, something like that. The land, as of course it all had to be done in those days, was granted by the monarchy, by the king. In more recent times, in modern times, I don't know that the Jesuits in Thailand have had many contacts, either positive or negative, with the monarchy. The reason is the Jesuits, after the suppression and after the restoration, Thailand was not one of the places where we traditionally worked. Myanmar was, and of course China was. But after 1949, many of the Spanish Jesuits were expelled from China, and they went to Thailand. And at the same time, the Maryland province Jesuits, the Americans, who were in Myanmar, they were expelled from Myanmar about the same time. And so they went to Thailand. Now, an interesting thing is, unlike most other countries in Asia, we did not start a school. And so we always remained quite small. We did student chaplaincy, prison chaplaincy, but no, and we had one or two parishes, but we never had many people in Thailand. This was never one of our big places in Asia. Until, in the past 10 years, more young Thais joined the Jesuits, and they said, it's time, we got enough people now, we should start our own school. So they looked around to see what kind of a school and where it should be and for whom it should be. And they said, well, the people who really need education, they're not getting it. Now you have a lot of other small Thai villages, and you'll find writing in Chinese on the walls and above the doors and that, but no real attempt to revive or preserve the tradition. And in fact, many of them have now moved into the cities because there's more opportunities for education, occupation, and that kind of thing. So generally, when the Chinese move out, the Aka move in. So many of those villages have now become mostly Aka. Even Thai has got an Aka majority. But I think you wanted to ask something further.
I had one more question, thank you. So Imtiaz you've actually written quite a bit on the Chularaj Monastery, the institution of Muslims in Thailand. And I'm wondering, one thing I understood from that is almost a tension between the Malays of the south, who want some sort of, almost like a Chularaj Monastery of their own in many ways, versus the ones who get appointed to this kind of official position of like a mufti for Muslims, which is generally from Bangkok or some of the bigger cities, and they tend to be Thai Muslims. So do these hill tribes, do these northern Muslims kind of far off, do they play into that, or are they also, suffering from these issues of citizenship and being in these kind of rural areas? Or do they get this representation?
No, they're much more integrated, I would think. Those things are just not an issue in northern Thailand. And they seem very distant from kind of Muslim battles of who is the Chula Montri and no, it's I've been to the south and I've lived in Bangkok, and those things are much more heatedly discussed and debated. But in the north, no, you don't find people talking about that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question, quick question. Do you talk about the Muslim in the South Asia, but do you know these people did have any, for example, idea about the politics or thought or something like this, for example, about the government or these issues or not?
Well, of course, not all Muslims would feel the same. Some are highly politicized, particularly in the south. I think people are poorer and they feel more oppressed, and so there's more discontent. There's more feeling that, they really feel they feel like Malaysians. They're close to Malaysia culturally, historically, religiously. They're Shafi Muslims like them. Linguistically, they speak the same language, Malay. And you might remember during World War II that the Thais were often sympathetic to the Japanese, and the Muslims tended to be more sympathetic to the British, who were in Malaysia. When World War II was over, there was a kind of a dispute between England and the United States. England wanted to really punish the Thais. They said they were collaborators and they were losers, so they lost the war and they should be punished. And the Americans said no. They saw Thailand as kind of the bulwark against communism in Asia. So the British were really saying that, okay, it's time to put the 3 southern Malay provinces into Malaysia, which was being formed at the time. And the Americans said no. But from that time on, there's been this feeling among the southern Malay Muslims that, history has treated us wrongly. We're in the wrong country. We're a tiny minority among people who don't understand us and who don't appreciate us, and so a feeling of either wanting independence or unity with Malaysia. Up in the north, the Muslims don't feel oppressed. As a matter of fact, Thailand was a liberating experience for them to come to a place where they escaped the persecutions in China and then later in Myanmar. And so they're quite happy with it. They learned to speak Thai. They not very politically oriented at all. So a lot of people's political orientation depends on how well you feel yourself in your situation. If you feel oppressed, if you feel disliked, if you feel discriminated against, then you're going to be more politically active than And if you feel, well, everything's going fine, where do you want to be? So in North, we don't see so much of that. Yes, sir.
Small questions about traditional culture. It's very fascinating to me. Is there a Confucian element or ancestor veneration? And I also wanted to ask, in those little chapels, what are the faces of the traditional deities like? Are they human? Are they ancestor? Do you have any sense of that?
They look like people. They look like little dolls. They look like people. They aren't. See, in a Buddhist temple, a Thai Buddhist temple, the figures would be very stylized. They look very dramatic and beautiful. Whereas in the little shrines, no, they look like little dolls. Really, and people.
Any sense of ancestors?
Gifts.
Any
Yeah,
sense of-
ancestors.
Yeah.
And an interesting thing I find, which has to do with when we talk in Christian terms, is my students don't see any difference between ghost and spirit and angel.
Wow.
It's it's one thing. You can talk about the spirits. Oh, there's spirits all over. Or sometimes they'll talk about the angels. Angels are all over. Sometimes they'll talk about the ghosts. They believe, all of them believe very strongly in all of these.
And so different words for each one of them.
No,
No.
same words for, they're alternatives really. And so of course if we talk about spirit, well then that sounds quite Christian, doesn't it? Or angel. Although the Thais have knots which are like angels or spirits also, So it's a different way to make distinctions, and our students who all come from villages, they would really know quite a bit about the spirits or about the ghosts. And sometimes when they're talking about the worship at the shrines, at the popular religion, they'll talk about that as worshiping ghosts, worshiping spirits. They usually say ghosts. Or some of them will say, well, I used to worship ghosts, but then I became a Christian. No, I don't.
But they still communicate with
Yeah.
Could you comment on the role of the monarchy in interreligious? I have two questions. This is the first one. Could you comment on the role of the monarchy in interreligious dialogue, and could you comment on the historical relationship that the Jesuits have had with the monarchy in Thailand?
Yeah. Well, the Jesuits first started in Thailand in Lopburi. I guess it was 16th century, so they got there very early. And then from there they went to Ayutthaya and were there until it was destroyed by the Burmese. And the ruins of the Jesuit church in both Lopburi and in Ayutthaya are still there. And they even had a college in Ayutthaya at one point. I don't think it had many students, maybe 19, 20 students, something like that. The land, as of course it all had to be done in those days, was granted by the monarchy, by the king. In more recent times, in modern times, I don't know that the Jesuits in Thailand have had many contacts, either positive or negative, with the monarchy. The reason is the Jesuits, after the suppression and after the restoration, Thailand was not one of the places where we traditionally worked. Myanmar was, and of course China was. But after 1949, many of the Spanish Jesuits were expelled from China, and they went to Thailand. And at the same time, the Maryland province Jesuits, the Americans, who were in Myanmar, they were expelled from Myanmar about the same time. And so they went to Thailand. Now, an interesting thing is, unlike most other countries in Asia, we did not start a school. And so we always remained quite small. We did student chaplaincy, prison chaplaincy, but no, and we had 1 or 2 parishes, but we never had many people in Thailand. This was never one of our big places in Asia. Until, say, in the past 10 years, more young Thais joined the Jesuits, and they said, it's time, we've got enough people now, we should start our own school. So they looked around to see what kind of a school and where it should be and for whom it should be. And they said, well, the people who really need education, they're not getting it. So that's why we're up at the very northern tip of Myanmar. If you look at a map of Myanmar, put your finger on the northernmost spot, that's where we are. And so here's Laos, and here's Myanmar, and here's us. So what's called the Golden Triangle. We really haven't had much relationship with the monarchy. However, our students and their parents, they've had really good relations and good feelings towards the monarchy, because it was the grandmother of the present king, and she's the one they call Mefaluang, the mother from the sky, because she would fly in. Up until that time, there had been this big program of eradicating the opium fields, and the CIA was very much involved in that, but they were doing it in a military fashion. You know, they bring in helicopters with Agent Orange or some other herbicide, and they kill everything. You know, everything would be wiped out, and then they'd arrest all the farmers. And it was the grandmother of the king said, we can't keep on doing this, arresting our people, destroying their livelihood, that we've really got to do something to give them an alternative method of livelihood. So she started these big projects, really huge projects of growing coffee, tea, mushrooms, vegetables, and real cocoa. Now they're doing cocoa as well, and they've really become a big fish ponds. They've transformed a lot of the villages, so that our people, the students that I teach, they love especially the grandmother of the present king. And of course, everybody in Thailand loved the king, the father of the present king. And the current king, well, they're still kind of undecided, but they all did love the father and especially the grandmother. But the Jesuits, I don't think we ever had any relations for or against.
Really fascinating. Can I ask just one more question quickly? It was so interesting to hear the difference between the southern Thai Muslims and the northern Thai Muslims, ethnically in different ways. Is there any relationship between the two communities? Do they pay attention to one another? I'm thinking about modern South Africa, where Cape Malays and Durban, Natal, and Transvaal, where the British came 200 years later, and India, and the Cape Malays just ignore. Yeah, they used to consider them a little bit different.
Yeah.
So, is there any of that?
I think it's more that they just live in two different worlds. We have a Malay mosque, one Malay mosque in Masai, and they in the southern Muslims will go there. There will be people who come, you know, and looking for work or something, maybe displaced. I don't know myself. if there are many differences in the worship between the Hanafi tradition and the Shafi'i tradition,
If you're
but
benefiting the North.
in the Hanafi in the north, Shafi'i in the south, but they do have their own separate mosque.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. We so appreciate